Hi, everyone. You are tuned in to the first attire seminar of the second semester in 2021. We are hosting this seminar series at HUMA, the Institute for Humanities in Africa at the University of Cape Town. And my colleagues are here, and we have other guests in the room. We're all here to see and hear a presentation from Chido Johnson, who is tuning in from Detroit, where it is just before noon in Detroit, and we are just after 5 o'clock here in Cape Town. So Detroit is connected to Zimbabwe in some interesting ways, and Chido is going to talk about the work that he's doing that plays on those connections and reinforces those connections. Chido is the head of sculpture at the College for Creative Studies in Detroit. And Chido and I are both colleagues and dear friends who we've known each other for the last 20 years or so. And the way that we met was I was on a flight from New York back to Zimbabwe, where I was studying. I was a student doing my master's at New York University. And the person sitting next to me on the flight, we started up a conversation, and she said, "Oh, you should really meet Chido Johnson. He's also a Zimbabwean artist who's in the States, and he was then living in Philadelphia." And so I got in touch with Chido, and we made a plan, and I went out there in about 2000, 2001, somewhere around there. And we met in Philadelphia. And then we saw each other again in March 2020 as the COVID pandemic was gripping the world, and I was in Detroit on some work. And I think that was the first time we'd actually seen each other since that first meeting. Even though it felt like at that moment that it didn't feel like 20 years that it had passed in between. So Chido hosted me there in March and showed me a lot of his projects in Detroit. And so today it's really a pleasure to host Chido at HUMA and have him contribute to our work, looking at Pan-Africanism, looking at interdisciplinarity, creative means of research. And so what Chido has shared before the seminar is a series of documentation, videos, and text about projects that he's going to talk about on this seminar series. So he'll be talking about his work with wire cars, his work with a puppet project that involves his parents, and also at this Motown Zimbabwe connection and the connection through dance, through the JIT dance. So yeah, I'll leave the rest to Chido. I know that he has some material in his presentation that shows how he got into this area and his background and his work and his personal background. So thank you very much to everyone who's here, and thanks to Chido for joining us, and thanks to HUMA for hosting this seminar.
Thank you, Ralph. And I'm really honored to be here. I'm kind of grateful that you're in an intimate space, so my heart's not pounding. But yeah, thank you all for coming and giving me this opportunity, Pumat, for me to share my work. Naturally, my work I'm going to talk about is picking just a few projects that are vastly are related, but vastly slightly different of a practice, but connected, just to give you guys a vast, more of a broader idea of how I work. So I'm going to share with you a PowerPoint of just images that I put together for you. Okay, so I feel the best way, I first make sure, can you all hear me okay? Is audio okay?
Perfect.
Yeah, it seems good.
Great. Okay, so I think more importantly to start out, perception, point of perception, like Donna Haraway has stated very well, it's not what is it, but who is looking at it and from where. So I guess I have to place who is and from where. My name is Chido. I was born in Mutoko, which is the northern part of Zimbabwe. That's me chilling with my crew, watching my father do a puppet show. My father was originally from the USA. He's master's in fine art, theology, and a doctorate education. So he opened up schools. My mother's a medical doctor, opening up hospitals. So that's my childhood was more in the rural area. As you guys are very aware, that area was an exciting time. I was born in the end of the 60s, like right at the tip of 69. But we're talking more about 70s. Very aware of the frontline states, where all the countries north of you bonded together to help fight what you were struggling with in the South. As you know, the more Kenneth County in the middle, KKK forever, who, as you guys know, probably recently passed away, with some of Michelle, Mugabe, all these, that spirit of Pan-Africanism was so huge at that time. My parents were unfortunately not very good citizens in the apartheid regime of Rhodesia at the time. And my father was doing political cartoons for a revolutionary paper, and that image on the right is what actually got him deported. That's a newspaper article. There were some demonstrators, at the airport, as my parents were respected in what they did. And when we were deported, I went to Zambia, good times, lived there for 6 years, and kind of shaped. Zambia was, of course, this was by now heading into the 80s. But Zambia, Kaunda had done an amazing job about uniting all the differences that existed. And, Tienda Pamozi, we worked together, and my education was amazing in primary school, where I learned, it was an amazing sense of all the possibilities of the future we can live in. But to jump forward, after independence, moved back to Zimbabwe, did my high school, and then as an adult, being shaped by my father's puppetry, and this objects that performs, and the content in terms of a voice. And when I was in high school, I remember when some of my show was shot down, which that, by the way, that picture of Mugabe was just like a few days before that happened. I remember, that we arranged, me and a friend stayed up in the art class, painting posters. And then the next morning we stand in line and we marched all the way to Mutare demonstrating. At that time it was Botha. And, it was that spirit of revolution was there, the excitement of revolution. And as an adult growing older, it's like I was in a transitional country that was trying to redefine itself. As you guys are very aware of what, stone sculpture, Zimbabwe's, so-called Shona sculpture. And that was my first initial entering. But I was very aware of my European heritage, a straight up white boy. So finally, I found this process of stone as a way that kind of connected my processes, like suddenly there's something in Zimbabwe as a physical process that connected to my European history of a process. And through process, I connected this, of course, Michelangelo on the left, David, and that's me on the right, piece called Iri. And this became my life. On the left is a piece at Notre Dame in the courtyard. And the one on the right is at the Hatso High School, where I went to high school. And they still exist, facing each other 8,000 miles apart, from a courtyard at University of Notre Dame and at the campus of Hatso High School in Mutare Mudara. As you guys very aware, this from here to here to here. And that notion of that space, when I'd gone to the USA, did my master's, was, everybody asks you where you're from. And as a child, I was always asked where I was from. It's like, you know, Bakupi, then in the end to be like, okay, my parents from the USA, I didn't know what USA was. In high school, got into breakdance, all that kind of imagining what the USA was about. But it was just this kind of performance idea. And of course, you come to the USA, then people are like, where you from? Accent, all that. And, Africa becomes one larger country and you try to define the specificities, and try to get most. And this piece actually, which is the same piece above here on the left, I just love how people claimed it and start playing with it, which is what I'll do with myself. So the stone on the, that stone, I did this also in my undergraduate work. And the stone, the black stone is separated from Zimbabwe, the neck is Carrara Italian, and the bottom part of the body is limestone from Alabama. So it's kind of like that, embracing that eclecticism of a body, I was really addressing in my early 20s what that meant through stone, But what got me into carving stone was 19 years old, was Tafuma Kutsa, where, as you should all know, one of the leading avant-garde artists of Zimbabwe that made a big shift. I got into, I wanted to be a stone sculptor, Pambrinajo, but then in the end was like, Tafuma was like, hell no, I'm not a Shona sculptor. I'm an international artist. And he started bringing this other context of making me read, Frantz Fanon, Black Skin, White Man, made me read and research post-colonial rhetoric at that young age, just blowing me into a new world. And he was starting to move away from stone sculpture as this kind of imposed language and looking at the world around. His more recent work, for example, is Basket Case 2, where he went to Honde Valley and looked at people who were making baskets. And since tourism had dropped, it's like, how can we use our technologies for other elements, So looking at how you can make architecture through basketry. So that's kind of how his mind, but if you see from that previous picture, he walked with his pieces, I was interested in other artists as well, like this Milan Nizak, European artist who also it is in the European context, also questioning the fighting capitalism and looking at the capital object and bringing the object as a performative object in the community context. Like this is a piece he did, head of a crowd. And I loved with him, like he still embraced objecthood. Like, there's hybrid objects that, as you might see, are remnants to Heinrich Bosch, looking at how the contemporary virtual versus real space is very comparable to the medieval period when one shifted and adopted different identities, But I love the fact that he just threw this stuff, not in a white cube, but out into the dirt, into space, so it can live in space, And then, theoretically, I'll say Mundimbe has been one of my, most clarity in questions, not in thought, not in the terms of its literal solutionary position, but in questions where, I remember Manthia Diwara talked a lot about him in comparison to Michel Foucault, where, Michel Foucault in academia, in the West especially, has been like embraced as the guru, like this guy totally changed Western philosophy, it's all about power relationships. And Mundimbe was like, that's all cool. But how do we even enter that discourse? The structures of that discourse. Yes, we can all agree it's a discourse of power relationship, but what are the construct of the how do we even structure how we even start the critique? Another person I have to tap my hat off is Claire Bishop, who has written, having worked a lot with community-based projects, she wrote a big critique of that kind of work in Artificial Hell, which I love to read. As we know, as much as I work in a social context, we know the critiques we have in Southern Africa with NGOs, so art has simply adopted those critical spaces too, which are questionable, And she also wrote some really great context of about installation art, which kind of shifting what is the object. And one way she looked at a critique is like this post-colonial feminist position, where we look at the traditional Italian perspective that we're taught in our art schools, in Bauhaus, get to know your perspective, get to know your point of perspective. And she looked at that as how one stands in front of that as an individual, because you can't find that point of perception more than one person looking at the painting. You all have to, one at a time. So that moment, the viewer becomes heroic, becomes a powerful, owns perspective, So you think of that mentality where art is playing a role of perpetuating a certain context, a way of thinking, um, this is a snippet from Jennifer Lynch, was a daughter of David Lynch. You guys might know Twin Peaks and all that. That's David Lynch. He's also a visual artist as well. But Jennifer Lynch did this movie called Boxing Elena. Basically, the doctor, you see the woman on the right, is basically chopped up to look like his sculpture on the left. And it's kind of how we force things. We force this language, and we're in academia, so we kind of have a tendency of trying to perpetuate this object, this existential object. What are we looking at? I mean, it's not necessarily the person. There's no head, no arms or anything, but oh my God, it's fucking beautiful, and we're perpetuating these notions of beauty that we perpetuate. And who shapes those notions of beauty? And that's what Muniba is talking about. It's like, okay, but the word beauty, the word ideal, is so ingrained in us, that even our institutions back in Zen might know, and probably similar to South Africa, they is still like, man, I want to do a torso. What? Why? When you look at culturally, historically, when you go back, there was no, that history wasn't there, So I started looking at other alternatives. This is, as a kid, cruising, so I explored that as an adult. And one way is just like start to explore other ways and where the object performs as not extension. It's just a bloody car, Of course, I made a jambarara, and I don't know if any, some of you might know jambarara. Jambarara means long car. And it was when I started realizing the connection with Detroit. It's like we were taught to make these long cars as kids. The only notions of long car jambarara is the USA cars that are coming to Zimbabwe, to Southern Africa. So this practice of the other, is it really the other? How connected is a hybrid form? We're connected, because the fantasy existed, industry existed, it kind of shifted. This is Woodward Dream Cruise, which is an annual cruise that happens in USA because Woodward Avenue is the first highway that had cars rolling on it since the Ford industry. So I did the link I showed you, a dance of Diego, was based on Diego's mural here, that he has in the DIA, which is front of Woodward Avenue, the first highway. And as you can see, the machinery here is not really the machinery at the Ford Museum. This has a reference to almost an Aztec god where he comes from, Mexico. So it kind of like shows how he was ready kind of re-narrating or reforming or reimagining what was in the world industry. Like how could community be looked upon differently through industry? But come down to it, it's like, it was amazing for me as this hyphenated identity to be in Detroit and be in a city of that first time in the USA that I felt embraced as a symbol of immigrant culture, where you didn't have to become American, whatever that meant, But going back to the Wirecar project, that's why it came from Dance of Diego's front of the DIA. I went around, and DIA means Detroit Institute of Art, where that mural is in. I went around doing workshops all over the city in vast spaces. And then we became a union, as you see that logo, United Auto Worker Association of Detroit, we became our own union. And kind of like getting together, each person questioning the idea of industry in a way where it's not about this kind of vertical interest, or horizontal individual. Everybody makes their fantasy of their own car, gets ownership of imagining fantasy of cruising. And then as an organization, we produce parking structures and organize cruises. So this is an exhibit, for example, that had probably about 200 cars of people who came individually with their own cars that they had made. This is probably one of the highest, fame when we're showing the museums, but we're showing at Automobile Hall of Fame. Hello, that was nice. And this was a combi we did, the group of us. First, bad picture, but if you see my arrow right there is actually a beaded word saying Wawad. So it's actually the first Wawad vehicle made by 9 artists together. We collaborated together, and it was brought to the National Gallery of Zimbabwe, which was a proud moment as the first combi wire car from Detroit to the National Gallery of Zimbabwe. It was part of a show created by Christina Yene and Raphael Chukukwa called Pimp My Combi. And we've had some guests through time, Mr. Ralph, cruising in the neighborhood. But yeah, going back to those spaces, having been raised with my perspective of USA through this barbed wire consulate embassy, and that's what my friends back in Zim, it's a witness. Every time you want to get a visa, all that, it's very unwelcome, and I remember once I was brought in 2010 as one of the core judges for an exhibit that at the National Gallery of Zimbabwe, which ended up awarding people like Gareth Nyandoro, which you guys might know, Mishek Majamvu and others, but I'd wanted to get a fourth prize, and I went and begged, I'm a USA citizen, come on. Spanish was coming, embassy, the British embassy was coming in too, and I was just begging USA embassy, come on, can you just give some kind of award for a fourth prize? No. And it was just kind of that symbol of how the USA had this kind of relationship, which we can talk more in depth about, but of course I'm not the resource, but it was a troublesome as a USA citizen and related to the USA. So I, living in Detroit, I finally bought a house, and a friend of mine called me up and said, "Do you know the Zimbabwean consulate is in Detroit?" I was like, "What?" I got so hyped up about it. I want to meet these people, and she was like, "No, just joking, man. You got a house. That's the consulate." And this rang a bell like that. There was already a project that Ralph mentioned, a friend of ours that he met on a plane, Naomi Nyanungo. Was a professor at time at African University later on, and we collaborated on projects connecting the two spaces. So this suddenly became an opportunity. And Naomi Nyanungu and I collaborated with Kumblani Zambuchia, a documentary filmmaker on the right there. And then we're like, man, let's turn our houses into consulate. Yeah, let's be Zimbabwe Cultural Center. So Kumblani Zambuchia on the right turned his house in Warren as a consulate, and I did mine, and we painted our rooms green, nationalistic green, green land, green space, non-space, so very much about space and non-space at the same time. And this is one of our projects. This is actually Warren Park, and this is Detroit, and 2 DJs mixing live at the same time with the intentions of recording the sound in that no man's virtual land space, which we have quite a few recordings from that. We call them Skype and Mix, kind of dated now. And we had exhibits. This is a Delta Gallery in Harare. And people, if you see my arrow again, this is a projection here live from Detroit, where these are actually poets watching onto the center stage to the right, poets reading their poetry. So both sides end up playing roles. This is in Detroit, where in Detroit, the artists read theirs and vice versa, in terms of poetry. But otherwise, there were all this about exchanges, both virtual and physical exchanges. One of them being the JIT exchange, which I'll later on show a video. But one we did did get a grant to bring through a Knights Foundation that we had to match, and we were able to bring artists from Detroit to Zimbabwe. Take some artists from Detroit to Zimbabwe and vice versa. And so this is a Joyce Jinja Makwenda, who's is a publisher. She's been writing for years. And that's her on the far at the end there. She's together with Masha Music and Martha Reeves. Martha Reeves, you might know her, one of the original Motowns. But Masha Music on the far left, this is her father, Voss Battle, who opened up Joe's record store, which was one of the first Black-owned record stores in the USA, in Detroit. He's famous because one day he used to mostly record jazz and even religious like sermons. And one of the ministers said, "Hey, you should record my daughter." And the daughter showed up, and he recorded a 13-year-old woman singing, young girl singing. It was Aretha Franklin. So that's the history of her record. But the important part is that on the right side is Joyce Njamakwenda, who is in Mbare at her archive space, and she owns one of the largest township music archive. And the important part of this narrative is the PO box. The fact that we're going for the narrative is coming from a specific PO box of Mbare to a PO box in Detroit, corner streets. So it becomes this notions of how to connect. The Zimbabwe Cultural Center of Detroit became this space to connect these vastly separate spaces, not in these notions of continents to nationalism, but to actual communities, to individuals. But now we've been expanding. I'm actually wearing the T-shirt here too, Detroit Sadza. But this is Kumbulani Zambuchia, collaborator in Zim, with his mom harvesting corn, maize. And we're looking at a building right now that we're working on right now that we're going to turn into Sadza space, which will house the Zimbabwe Culture Center and the first headquarters for the Wayaka Auto Workers Association of Detroit. But I think to round that, I'll show you guys as I get off this to another space to show videos, is I think that what's exciting about this is just this, even in the USA very specifically, in Africa, we probably would not be having this context of a Zimbabwe Culture Center. Everybody is very aware of their place, and where there's a need to kind of expand outside. But in the USA, there is plenty of African centers, culture centers, but again, there's not acknowledged the hyphenated space within Africa. So there's a lot of Italian American, Chinese American, Polish American, but very rarely do you have hyphenated African. And that's why we thought it was very important for this thing to exist. And this again is I can't emphasize enough that this is a big group of us working together on this. And then I thought I'll go back to puppetry as a final example of project of my work. As I started out by showing my father's a puppeteer, and I think it just came back to the performative. I mean, I have several other objects that definitely not puppets that are performative as sculptural objects, but I think we talked about. When Ralph and I were discussing what I could talk about, just think about blurring time and space. I think was a nice way to think of a way to. I mean, of course, we're talking of physical space, Zimbabwe and Detroit right now, but just thinking about there's also about how, especially the diasporas, we are kind of connected to a certain time where we left, so it kind of linked to a time while people who stay are kind of shifting through that time. So the notion of spaces change. And the other is going back to the narrative of like the specificity of narratives is where are the stories, what are the stories coming from? And the time shifts with that narrative. So this piece called Amina started in 1960. My father met a gentleman called Barnabas Dudzo and asked him, hey, can we do a puppet show called, David and Goliath? So the right side is David by Barnabas Dudzo and the left side is Goliath by my father. That's Barnabas Dudzo. And then, but all my life, I was told about these puppets that never performed. My father thought the heads were too good to be puppets, so they were on the bookshelves. But 5 years ago, I met Shepherd Ludzo, the son of Barnabas Ludzo, and we're like, man, we need to carve our hands for our father and kind of fulfill this piece, and that's what we did. And then it became this performance. So if you think about it, it started in 1960 and did not get fully realized until 2019. But of course, the narrative had changed since then. Because, before with my father, it was David had to kill Goliath. But as we know, contemporary, we're talking about the Philistines, e.g. Palestine, is this perpetual narrative of this idealized narrative that's always through the perspective of David. And how does one really try hard to analyze and question narratives and perceptions and point of perceptions?
Thanks, Chido. Are you going to show a small clip of the JIT video, and then
sure,
yeah,
I can totally I can do
about another 5 minutes or so.
Boom. So you guys can see this?
Yeah.
So on the right is Halim Rasul, aka Strings, who's a JIT master from Detroit. And on the left is Franco Daka, aka Slomo. Franco Daka used to dance for Alex Macheso and kind of the inventors of Borodale dance, if you guys are aware of that. Rasul Strings was like, I remember coming across him he was doing JIT workshops, what the hell? JIT, this is Zim stuff. What are you talking about, JIT in Detroit? But JIT is a dance derived originally from Detroit that started in the 70s, got popular in the 80s because of a TV show called The Scene. And The Scene was kind of like Detroit's version of Soul Train. As you know, JIT in Zimbabwe started also kind of in the 70s. Of course, it's older with GT, but in terms of JIT, J-I-T, it started in the 70s, Bundu Boys, Alex Machesu, all that crew. And then in 1980, it got more popular because of independence. So it's weird, the same name, same timeline. And the weird part about it is that dance is almost mirrored. It's only one's electronic music and one is rumba. So the exchange here is that Halim Rasood from Detroit danced to Franco Daka's music, but doing JIT, Detroit style JIT, while Franco Daka danced to his style Borodale, which is equivalent to Detroit JIT dance, but to Halim's music.
I don't hear the music playing, Chido. Do you?
Yeah. Hear me. Let me. Sorry. Pause for a second. I need to change the audio.
I could hear it there.
Okay,
that's. I know. When you do the screen share, there's a little tick box. Yeah, that's right. Thanks, Chido. Great. So thanks very much for that presentation and the JIT video at the end. I'm amazed at how well the Zimbabwean JIT dancing goes with the Detroit electronic music, with the techno. It's like, yeah. Did they come and do workshops to teach other people the dancing styles in each places?
Well, Halim Rasul, we got, just like Joyce Jinjamakwenda, Halim, Joyce Jinjamakwenda got a research fellowship through us, through ZCCD, Zimbabwe Cultural Center, to Detroit. We did the same for Halim Rasul. He went down to Zimbabwe for six weeks to both learn JIT and GT, while at the same time teach Detroit JIT to dance communities. We work collaboratively with Jubilika Dance Trust, Port Marco, and just toured around Zim. We did a sonic exchange more recently where we brought Mono Mukundu, who I don't know if you guys know, but Mono Mukundu played with Ovam Tukudzi and quite a few others too. And he came to Zim, to Detroit, to educate people about JIT music. So he had the whole vast knowledge himself, but also we started doing hybrids between the together with electronic. So we had some techno DJs here work collaboratively with him to try to find the similar beat that works for both dances.
That's great.
Yeah.
So at this point of the seminar, we open up to discussion. So I'll ask my my co-hosts to also help identify people. If you'd like to use the reactions tab to put your hand up, then we can see you. Otherwise, indicate if you have any questions. See. I mean, I can definitely continue the conversation with you myself, Chido, but here we have Vanessa. Vanessa has her hand up. I'm going to ask you to unmute, so that I think you can speak now. And if you could put your video on as well, Vanessa, that would be great.
Cool. Thank you so much. I will try not to put my video on because my network is quite shaky.
Okay.
So that might interrupt it completely. But
Sure.
Thank you so much, Chido, for your talk. It was really, really incredibly fascinating. So I'm really curious, I guess, about the idea of a center. So, with the Zimbabwean Cultural Center, the word center is very, very interesting in this context, I think, because there seems to be, just from your background story and also kind of the exchanges that are happening across time and space. I'm just wondering if the centers themselves are an attempt to create an actual geospatial center. And if that is the case, kind of what are the, perhaps one way of asking it is, kind of what is the intention there? Is there a sense of displacement or disorientation that the center is trying to cater to, or is there something else going on there? I'm just really curious to hear what your thoughts are on that. Thanks.
No, thank you, Vanessa. Yeah, that's a good question. That's a very good question. Before, when we had the two houses, it was so important to have, because the houses were more like an idea. It was two domestic homes. It was more of an idea. The narratives had to be very specific, the Detroit, and either, Chitungwiza or something. But now that we're getting a location, the structures becoming more solid, it makes the narratives open up more. So I think what we love about it is that it opens up to a potential more of a Pan-Africanist language, but still defining a physical space like Zimbabwe, a place where it's a country that's defined by left. If you take a right to a left, and then there's a tree there, it's basically saying, hey, it's where that building of rocks is made out of, So there's a symbolism of a place that's defined by description. So we are kind of the place that eats sadza, But I think when what's very interesting about hyphenated, I think that
I know I'm not alone. I have a few of my colleagues who are in these projects too, like who we discuss about what that hyphenation means, and the hyphenations is something that's consistent in Southern Africa as well. I mean, we look at the Luva-Lunda migration, looking for soap that gave birth to Zimbabwe too, but also there is, even the USA, the notion of the hyphen is that we sometimes focus, either we focus heavily on the hyphen, like kind of celebrating this gray spaces, or we focus on binaries that are more contradictory. But I think what we want to do is focus on both, so that we're celebrating the reimagined, the experience, the reimagined, while at the same time acknowledging the history. So it's a physical archive. It's going to have an archive, for example, room with authors, Zimbabwean authors and books, and expansion away from Zimbabwe, maybe Zambia, wherever. And but also imagining the possibilities of what could be, which means like not things that necessarily exist historically, but right now, but what could be reimagined for the future. So a space of creative possibilities. Does that make does it come close to answering you, Vanessa?
It does. It really does. And if I can just kind of like to just follow up on that. So you mentioned that like the hyphen becomes really quite a point of emphasis because it creates some kind of gray space. Is this an attempt then to transcend that gray space and to create something that is more than that and is something else completely?
Well, I think, as we live today, for example, in the identities of questioning, our binaries, as some of us celebrate non-binary. I think the fact is there is to a point somewhere, there is, it's just where your eye rests. So I guess it's, it's not that we don't, I think especially as visual artists or as artists in general, like you can come out of my presentation with more questions than answers. And I think that's where we live, is this we're driven by these questions that don't have an answer, basically trying to find a solution. So in that context, as a culture is constantly changing and shifting, I don't think we have a point. I think it's more about embracing kind of that spaces of where things collided and sparked something, and what that spark was possibly. And that spark could be interpreted very different depending on who witnesses it or versus who experienced it, who ignited it. But I think the beauty is archiving and recording those different narratives and embracing those separate narratives, not finding a singular narrative, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I think it's really fascinating that it seems to me that there's it's really progressive in that it recognizes that space is a moving target, and really it is defined by the constant chase of that target and not necessarily being bogged down by wherever or whatever it might be in like a certain moment. So thank you so much for sharing your work. It's absolutely fascinating.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Vanessa, for those perceptive questions and that conversation with you and Chido. I want to maybe just jump off from those points about multiple narratives instead of a singular narrative, and this idea perhaps of art as research, which is one of the things we're interested in at Humor, and is particular to this seminar today, is that most of the seminars we run center on an academic paper, like a published text or a text that's in development in order to be published in a journal. And something we're wanting to do is to expand our definition of intellectual work and research to not just be written text, words on a page, but to incorporate other forms of expression. So in your case, visual art and performance. We even have food on the agenda later in the semester. So yeah, what do you think about that broad idea of how art functions as a tool of inquiry or a research tool, and has that got something to do with the openness that you're embracing in your work?
I think definitely the arts has a position where just like you can listen to a melody from another cultural space that you don't understand the language, but you have a certain sense, an emotional reaction towards that melody. There is something there that trigger, that we catch as human, but words end up becoming questionable. And I think but that space is actually a very rich space, because we know today that where we talk about history, it's his story. And whose story was it? Traditionally, it's a European story. So it's a white male perspective that has defined academia since the 19th century at the birth of universities and colleges all over the world. So how is academia really pushing those, questioning those? Or really, how are we becoming, e.g., Pan-Africanists, or how we, really Pan-Africanists, or how are we dealing globally? I mean, in the USA, people talk, universities looked upon as a global context, which we know is not necessarily true. So how are those narratives? So when we talk about a national character, that's this generalized notion of a national character, a potential individual within a nation. But what's beautiful about art is suddenly it reflects an individual, a person who might not be popular culture at that time, might be a singular individual, but there's a moment for us to enter that time and space and have a certain sense of what that could have, that sense of space and time could have been for that, which shifts potentially that narrative of that time and place. And I think that's what's the richness about art, is it has a potential of really us being able to utilize it to question narratives, to question power structured narratives, who owns that collection and therefore claimed this building to do that. And therefore we have to study it. What's the invested narrative? What's the uninvested narrative that is just as important? And I think that art is definitely that tool. And besides that, it's the language context too. It's a part where we try to find a sense of conversation that we're still embedded in canons, but it's kind of a space that one can kind of potentially break canons. So I'm not so sure. I mean, I think that's, because the uncertainty is the strength of it.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Are there any, I do have someone in mind to ask, but I'm just checking if there are any open questions. We encourage conversation here. And I know, Amina, one of my colleagues, Amina, please go ahead. I've asked you to unmute.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Chido. I just have a follow-up question based on what you just said in this attempt to rethink the ways in which we disseminate our research and our ideas. I was just really curious about how does one dismantle a canon or break a canon, which, yeah, as you mentioned, it's our constant attempt to portray our research through art as opposed to words, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And trust me, that's a question I have wondered over as an educator as well. So that's a really good question. And I think it's a question I think it's a process, it's not a solution, it's a process. But, thinking very highly about art, I mean, there is a notion about art as this kind of context of subversion, art is subversion. So subversing is a natural instinct that a lot of artists have. But at the same time, it's also the role of the narrators, not necessarily the art, because it's about, again, it's about going back to Donna Haraway, for example. It's not what is it, who's looking at it from where. So that object, e.g., like talking about the wire car, early on, but is it really about the wire car, or is it more about how the wire car was narrated? Whose narrative is it about? So I think the narration is just as important. You know, I remember as a graduate, I was trying to find like theoretical context within Africa, like critical about visual arts, and I kind of shifted into literary. And so people like Ngugi wa Thiong'o versus Chinua Achebe, who were fighting about English language, you know, and it was interesting about how Chinua Achebe discussed how he wrote with his own native language, like using the word translating, you know, with the word translated to English might be a recognizable word with its own rooted canons, but by how it's placed within the sentence, like how we read a word that's very hard to understand, but we read it like we don't know the word, but if we read the sentence, we suddenly don't go to dictionary because the whole sentence kind of frames the meaning of that word. But imagine if it's a recognizable word that's thrown into that sentence, then suddenly we suddenly imposing a separate canon, a different interpretation of that more familiar word due to its positioning in the sentence. And I think it comes from both ways. It's not necessarily about the artist's role in reimagining, but it's also the role of the narrator, the observer, in how it's recorded, which is very essential. And I think the way to do that is multiple, is defining this kind of notion of a hierarchical pinnacle approach towards translations, but more in terms of multiple translations that exist simultaneously at the same time. That's how I at least feel.
Thank you, Chido, and thank you, Amina. And
thank you so much, Jeff.
Great, thanks, Amina. And there's a person who had their hand up here, my colleague Sanya Osha, and I wanted to also just introduce Sanya, saying that Sanya, Chido, and myself, along with a few other artists, are also going to be on a panel on a sculpture conference in October that's being hosted in Detroit online. And Sanya is also a writer as well as a senior researcher at Humor. So I think, yeah, Sanya would be well placed to also comment on the ideas about writing, if that's where he's coming from, or wherever else you'd like to come from. Sanya, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Ralph. Thank you. Chido, I'm very intrigued and I'm also quite impressed by the way you are quite open and expressive about your notion of what art is supposed to be and what it's supposed to do, because not many artists are able to do that, that's to find words to express what they do, to theorize actually what they do. You mentioned a few things. If I mentioned art as inquiry, as a process of inquiry, you mentioned also the fact that it could be a subversive exercise. Art could be a subversive exercise. I'd just like you to elaborate on both those two notions. And if you have other ideas of what art could be, both as a personal journey and as a collective journey. I mean, because there are so many definitions of art, but I just, I was intrigued by, the ideas and notions you associate with art making. But I just wanted you to elaborate a bit more. If for instance, there are other expressions of art and other avenues to pursue it, both from the personal angle and the collective angle. Thank you.
Sanya, thank you so much for that question. It's actually something I was thinking about early on that I didn't talk about, but thank you so much, because that's actually, at least the way I've read your question, what's juicing up with my responses. So I might not be directly hit the spot, but the image that I showed of Michelangelo, for example, and those torsos, it's kind of how I was raised as an artist. And it's a kind of a heroic figure of an artist, the artist that, solely lives in a space and reflects from life and brings something. It's a very individualistic context, which is essential, as I mentioned before, because we have to break away from the general. And that is where successfully subversion occurs sometimes. But at the same time, I remember, I started, with Tapuma Gutta carving stone. We hung in the backyard carving with the all day. We spent carving all day, gossiping, And then I came to the USA to get my degree. And next thing, it's like, okay, now hide in the studio, make art by yourself. And it's like, wait, I enjoyed that community context. And it's like, you know, what we did. I still have to put a name sometimes as an individual, but the reason I like working in the collaborative context, like I was so excited when I met Shepard and worked that project with him. Even the last project I did sculpturally was called Ari, which was about 16 artists I put together to make one sculpture, kind of a exquisite cups, because we were isolating during COVID. So each one came to the gallery individually and placed an object to the whole body was produced. And it's just an idea that there's a collective context that can make an object. And I think there's a special space for that. And I know as an individual, I learned so much from that, because that's one way I grow up. Because I don't know if you ever work collaborative with people, it's not easy necessarily. Sometimes it just collapses, you can't work together and it sucks. But there are other times when it does, like rapture, really question you and make you have to shift and re-navigate yourself. And there's more of a learning position and a growth. And I think that's a very rich space, you know, where suddenly there's kind of a space that's produced. And I don't know if I'm shifting away, but I think the idea of when we work collectively, what I love about it is that we are kind of almost having this commune of what we do, not what I do. And when the we shifts away from the I think that's when it comes to possibly a translation of cultural production rather than individual expression. And I think cultural production becomes really interesting, because then it kind of shifts away from potential from economy and has a different kind of reactional audience or a responsive audience, or an intimate, it's weirdly more intimate in some ways too. But Sanya, I don't know if I really got to you, but it's something that I really question, you know, because I think we're definitely raised in, as an educator, where we educate individuals. We don't educate collaborators necessarily. It's very rare, you know, unless we orchestrate it within a class or something, or we don't orchestrate commune making, you know. It's about a name.
Thank you.
Thank you. I like your conclusion. That's very interesting, which is true. Yes, I think it's a very valid way to look at how we're educated as artists or creatives. You know, yeah. Very insightful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sanya, and thank you, Chido. And yeah, I've also welcomed your reminder that you're an educator as well as an artist, that you're a teacher, and you've been doing that for almost the last 20 years, I guess, in Detroit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I know that something that's central to your art practice is also that relationship between the object and then the relationships that form around it. And often, even though you actually make really beautiful objects and you're very skilled at working with media like stone and wood, that's quite difficult to form, your emphasis is often on the relationships that happen around the object rather than the object itself. And it's an interesting balance for an artist.
I mean, as an individual, it's a lot to do with just having to shift with languages and having to learn different languages, because language causes perception. I mean, English is actually my second language. Grew up speaking Shona, then learned English in school, and then went to Zambia and had to learn Tonga, Chewa and Chiwemba. And it's like those spaces where you constantly have to, like when you speak more than one language, most of you here do, it's like there's a mental shift, and I think that's kind of a space where we organically are in Southern Africa, I feel, and in the USA too, in some cases.
Thank you very much. I think that's a great point to conclude this seminar. We're right on the dot of 6 o'clock, so or noon with you, I think. So thank you, Thank you very much, Chido. That was a great presentation, and thank you for the questions and conversation from the other contributors here, from Vanessa and Amina and Sanya, and everyone else who's here in the Zoom room with us. Thanks to my director, Divine, and to the rest of the Humor crew, to Babacar here on the Attire Seminar series. And yeah, we'll keep you posted. Check back on the Humor website to find out more about the upcoming seminars. And it's really been a pleasure to have you here and an honor to have you here, Chido. So thanks for taking the time and all the best.
No, thank you so much. My honor has been for me.